Hi, and welcome back to Maple History. Today we will be talking about the Wendat people, and my guest for this is my friend Jessica.
Hello.
So what we'll be talking about today is the Wendat Confederacy and culture and society. There's a lot to cover in one episode, but I will try to give you a pretty good idea of how they lived, governed, worshipped, went to war, died, and what happened to Wendat people, I guess their souls, after death. You can never fully capture an understanding of a people with an hour's discussion, but I hope at the end of this you will get a feel for who the Wendat people were before they entered the era of European contact. So what I'm going to be talking about is pre-contact, and the Wendat Confederacy really started like 1400.
Okay.
And then it ended 1649. So
Okay.
we know those dates pretty well, but we're not going to get into that part. That's a whole other, that's European contact.
Okay.
And there's a lot to talk about in that, but that's going to be for another day. All right. So first off, who are the Wendat? And I say are because they still exist. Like they're just moved. Actually, that's something to note because a lot of people think that they were eliminated, but that's not true. They just were moved and dispersed and joined other people. So up until relatively recently, most people would have called the Wendat people the Huron. And I don't think I had heard the name Wendat until after university or maybe sometime during university. So
yeah, it seems a newer term. Huron is what I heard growing up as well.
Yeah. So admittedly, I didn't take that many courses on Indigenous 17th century history. But anyways, so archaeologist Bruce Trigger, who wrote the book on early Wendat people, even in like the prehistory, like deep archaeology, and up until the term that's used is dispersal, which is, it seems very sanitized.
So say, is there a distinction on dispersal versus diaspora?
So that's a good question about dispersal versus diaspora.
Yeah, I'm probably pronouncing it. It's one of those words you read, but you don't actually hear said. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's like an Irish diaspora. There's obviously the Jewish diaspora. That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe how fast it happened.
Maybe.
That it's not really immigration. It's just they were removed from
their own land. Yeah.
Yeah, they were, from like this kind of Simcoe County, North Lake Ontario kind of region. And then they just gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so Bruce Trigger wrote this doorstop of a book, The Children of, I'm going to try and say this because The Children of Aataentsic.
Okay.
Sorry, I tried to look it up and get pronunciation guides. Yeah. They weren't helpful. So in his book, he says that it's of great symbolic importance that the shift towards using the names that Indigenous people use for themselves replace the names that Europeans gave them. But he also noted in his book, in the introduction, that in the reprinting, that it would have been extremely time consuming for him to replace every time he said Huron with Wendat.
Yeah.
So he did not do that, or he didn't have one of his grad students do that. And I think the ubiquity of the name Huron in general society and older history books does make it difficult to make the shift in the popular mindset, but it is still worth doing.
Yeah.
Because again, it's not a difficult name to say.
No.
Wendat's easy. We can do that one. There's other Indigenous names that are a lot more challenging.
Yeah.
On an English speaking tongue. So to contrast, there was two more books that I've read about Wendat history, and they make different choices to one another. So one book by Kathryn Magee Labelle, it's called Dispersed, Not Destroyed, A History of 17th Century Wendat People. She uses the name Wendat, unless quoting an original source where the term Huron was used. And then on the flip side of that is Mark Bourie's book on Jean de Brébeuf, Crosses in the Sky. He uses the term Huron rather than Wendat, and he made a conscious choice to do that.
Because he's doing from the French perspective?
Yeah, he is doing, it is a biography, but it was he has a lot in there of kind of ethnohistory of the Wendat people as well. Definitely a lot of the Jesuits and early New France. But yeah, he explained his reasoning for the choices of why he made that choice. And I kind of disagree with him about why he did that. I'm going to get into that actually.
Okay.
I think it's important to talk about this because people get their backs up when they're asked to make a change of a name, something that they grew up with.
Yeah.
And we can make this shift. So just where did the name Huron come from? So Bruce Trigger explains that the story was passed down that the French sailors saw the hairstyles of the Wendat warriors and likened them to boar's bristles. So this may just be like a folk tale that they said because the term Hure was a common slang term for ruffian. It was already being used as slang. It was common. Mark Bourie's argument centers around the idea that Hure refers to the bristles of wild boars who are considered a dangerous prey that noblemen hunted as a pastime rather than an insulting reference to pigs. So he wrote, for years, some writers have seized on the idea that Huron comes from what they saw as a racist and insulting French term, hures, or boar's head. I do think the term Huron was given to the Wendat as an insult. But to say it was racist is a stretch. The French considered themselves to be the top tier of civilization and surely saw the indigenous people as barbarians. So yeah, they gave them a nickname and it stuck. The second part of Burry's argument was that the Wendat called themselves Huron at different points in time, including when they came to live outside Quebec City after they lost the war to the Haudenosaunee. And some modern people in Canada and the United States still call themselves Huron-Wendat. The final part of his argument is that the Huron is what people know this nation as, so it's easier to use in a non-academic history book. And I can see his point on that for sure, because it's a popular history. People know that it's easy to follow.
It keeps that continuity that people are like, this group is still here.
Yeah.
And was always here kind of thing.
Yeah. And the continuity of like, oh, these are the people that I learned about in school.
Yeah.
And just learning a different aspect of their history. And it is jarring to learn a whole new name for people. When for many people, they've gone their whole lives understanding that they're the Huron. And it's the Huron fought the Iroquois. And that's who were part of the early story of New France. But on the other hand, we learn new names for people all the time. The other points about it being actually not an insult, but a nod to a noble prey, and that they kind of like that name anyways, it just doesn't hold up for me. The French were basically calling the Wendat punks, and it stuck. So some people do answer to crap nicknames, which is what the Huron did. Like I guess you're calling us the Huron.
Yeah.
But they're asking us to stop now.
That's fair. Yeah.
But aside from his use of colonial names for Indigenous people, Crosses in the Sky is an excellent book. I really do recommend it. It's really good. All right. So we've got that sorted. So the Wendat Confederacy was made up of 4 nations. It started with 2, and then that nascent confederacy lasted about 200 years, according to oral tradition. So dates and times are not exact in an oral culture because it wasn't important to keep that kind of calendar exactness. So we can't be sure of the story of the creation of the Confederacy. And as Bruce Trigger notes about Wendat ideas about history, quote, the purpose of their traditions was not to preserve a literal memory of the past, but rather to supply them with a guide to the social, political, and moral order in which they lived.
Which I think is not unusual in many cultures. Like, the history of Rome has been very well documented. The origin story is very clearly a little bit made up. So I think an origin story and where our people came from, that it completely makes sense that there's it's as much about the values we feel we engender as it is about the actual, like, what happened and who did what.
Yeah. And they would it started 200 years ago. They're like, it started a really long time ago.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of what was probably meant more than in the year 1400.
Yes.
Our Confederacy began. Just like many generations ago, this Confederacy between these 2 nations started, and then we added 2 more, possibly 3 more, but things are iffy because their Confederacy wasn't as locked in as, say, the Haudenosaunee.
Okay.
So the first 2, this is where it gets tricky. You know what? I'm going to type in the chat the names so that you You can give your opinion on how they should be pronounced
I mean,
because
I've already failed at diaspora, so I don't hold out high hopes on this.
but maybe you've been to, I don't know, an indigenous storytelling event and you've heard names pronounced. Okay, so the original nations are, they're Bear Nation. Atignawatin, that one I can do. Atignawatin is Bear Nation. And Cord Nation, as in like rope making, cords.
Okay.
Atigna, I'm going to try, let's just do this again. AtignenonGnahac.
Okay. Oh, Atignin non. No.
Yep. All right. The pronunciation suggester via probably AI was
Yeah.
absurd. So not helpful. Okay. So the original nations were Atignawatin, that's Bear Nation,
Mhm.
and Atigninonyahac, Cord Nation.
Okay.
So that's probably around 1400. And around 1570, the Tahan Tainrat, people of the deer joined. And finally, in 1610, the Arendaronon, the nation of the rock, joined. Possibly another one joined in and around that time. The Atarancharon, the people of the marsh, joined. So it's 4 or 5 people in this confederacy, or sorry, not people, nations in this confederacy. And
Yep.
then they would have lived. So I gave you that map
Yep.
in and around Nottawasaga Bay on
Okay.
Georgian Bay, all around Lake Simcoe,
Okay.
and the top part of Lake Ontario, like a little south of Mississauga,
Okay.
and then all the way over to,
Like almost Montreal.
yeah, around there.
Okay.
And kind of this kind of wedge shape around there. And most of the sites are found west of Lake Simcoe, kind of Georgian Bay, down south to Toronto.
Okay.
The area, like the yellow area,
Mm-hmm.
is more Anishinaabe territory,
Okay.
and different ones around there. But they were more allied with them. I'm sure that they had some warfare or conflict.
Hunting part.
Yeah.
Well, and like traveling and.
Yeah.
Okay.
They weren't, the Anishinaabe didn't live in villages, especially the size of the Wendat, because the Wendat lived in villages around like maybe 1,000 people, like 1,000 to 2,000 people would be like the max of their largest villages.
Okay.
And population, kind of the max population before Europeans came, and disease and warfare and everything decimated them, be around 18,000. So it's just really hard to get those numbers
Okay.
accurately because censuses were not done.
No, yeah, you'd have to be sort of ballparking based on number of people in an archaeological site and then extrapolating.
Exactly. And then records kept by Jesuits when they were there, and because they would have sent back how many souls that they're trying to save at any given time.
Yeah.
And then there would be around 18 to 25 villages that they would lived in.
Okay.
So who were they? Now that we've got where they were. So the Wendat people, they don't have a pantheon of gods, but their origin myth is one of the places where characters. So in the Wendat story, the Aataentsic
Mhm.
is the mother of all humankind. She lived in the sky world, and depending on who's telling the story, because again, oral traditions change. You know, the Bear Nation may have had a slightly different version than Cord Nation.
Okay.
So she lived in the sky world. So she was either chasing a bear or cut down a tree to obtain medicine for her husband and fell through a hole in the sky.
Okay.
And as she was falling, the great tortoise saw her, who was swimming around in like a big sea.
Yeah.
And instructed animals to collect earth from the bottom of the water they were all swimming in and put it on his back. And this was done, and the earth formed, and Aataentsic landed gently on the earth that had been created. So often in the story, she's pregnant when she lands, and sometimes she gives birth to a daughter who in turn gives birth to twins, but sometimes she's the one who gives birth to the twins. So the twins are Iueskaha and Tawiskaran. Tawiskaran. So theirs is a very fractious relationship, which is quite common in twin stories.
Yeah.
So Iosca wounds Tawescaron, and from his blood flint forms, which will be used for weapons used by humans. And Iosca is responsible for creating rivers and lakes, corn growing, good weather. He's also the sun.
Okay.
And Aataentsic is the moon. So he's the sun because he just gives the growing season and all good things.
Yeah.
And he released all the animals that were in a cave, trapped in a cave. And Aataentsic always works in opposition to him. And then they live together in a bark cabin in the village of the dead. So something that's interesting is that Ioscaha is a male, and he is responsible for farming and the animals. And Aataentsic is a woman, and she brings the violence to this world, which is in opposition to how the lived world is.
Yeah.
The women bring forth life and do all the farming, and the men have the violence. So in the story, they're in opposition to it, which is quite an interesting
parallel symmetry,
like a mirror.
Yeah.
So it's really quite interesting. So related to Wendat's understanding of their origin myth is their concept of spirituality in general and religion. So for Wendat people, they didn't really have a religion that you took lessons or catechism on.
Yeah.
And it's not something that you can set aside because it's who you are in such a way that it's hard to like learn a new religion and then replace it.
Yeah.
So we'll find that out later when we do the post-contact.
Yeah.
So they believe everything had a soul, lakes, rivers, stones, rocks, and beings that could influence humans had something called Oki, O-K-I. But humans could also have Oki, but not everybody did. So people with Oki were the more extraordinary humans, as in great warriors, powerful shamans, and witches.
So big charisma, lots of life.
Yeah.
People who leave a big mark.
Yeah. Now, as for shamans, there was two types generally of shamans. So there was the Okata, who were a regular shaman who treated illnesses, interpreted dreams, and would do kind of regular ceremonies, healing ceremonies. And then the other type of shaman was the Aretsan, and they were the type that would treat spiritual attacks from witchcraft.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so shamans were really important for general health care.
So one's more physical health and one's more mental health?
You could be affected by witchcraft physically as well. There was different types of categories of illnesses. So there was natural causes, there was witchcraft, and then there was a soul's unfulfilled desire, which I will go into a little bit. So natural causes, your usual sicknesses, broken bones, but also depression. So like mental health. And if they couldn't understand where this illness was coming from, it would be witchcraft. Or if someone was really tormented mentally, probably witchcraft.
Makes sense.
But also the soul's unfulfilled desire would cause emotional or mental torment. And those would be revealed to a person with the shaman's help via dreams. And these unfulfilled desires and dream interpretation was really important to their understanding of themselves. And if there was an unfulfilled desire, the shamans and the community would work to resolve it. That dog. So they would just give them the dog.
Yeah.
Or a canoe or something, even if it because the spirit of the sense of generosity was just like, oh, well, I'll just give it to you. It's fine. Yeah. You can have it. But sometimes it could be extremely antisocial. As in, I want your wife.
Much harder to navigate.
Or you want to do something evil.
Yeah.
You want to commit a violence against someone. So the shaman would help to figure out how to cure that without disrupting the entire community by having this act done. So sometimes it's really simple. It's like someone says, I want all of their corn or all of their tobacco. Well, here, you can have a basket full of it. That's an easy, you give and then it's like, sure. And then they do ceremony and they are satisfied. Their like emotional turmoil can be ended. Sometimes it would be like, well, I want to kill that guy. Well, we can now take this dog. Sorry about mentioning the dogs, but they did that.
Yeah.
They would sacrifice the dog in his place. So that would kind of cure that very antisocial desire, so that they didn't disrupt the social cohesion of the village. Because like this is these are 1,000 people, right? And many of them would be your relatives.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, you can't just leave and go somewhere else. You have to find a way to all work together, or you're not going to go survive solo. For all of the people thinks, if I could just live by myself in the woods, life would be perfect. It's a lot harder than it looks. So,
and even if they left to go live with the Anishinaabe, you were trading with these people all of the time. If you went to Anishinaabe group, because they didn't have the villages, but they had kind of smaller, and then they would come together in the summertime for ceremonies and spending time together. That person's cousin might be married to someone within the Wendat village. Like, this is not, these are really, this is a very small world. So one of the ways they would cure any major disruption from illness and mental would be through curing ceremonies or festivals. So, and some of these were once the Jesuits come on the scene, they were quite shocked by some of them. They weren't fan of the dream interpretation either.
I mean, they can be a little uptight sometimes.
They're a lot. Yeah. They were a bit much. Even like your average Catholic thought, oh my God, these guys. So one of the curing ceremonies was the Anonharaya, and this was used when many people in the village were ill or depressed. So I can imagine in the wintertime, it would get a real bummer.
Yeah.
It's
cold, it's dark, it's no fun.
So kind of a mass depression could happen. So this was a 3-day festival that started with people boisterously breaking into houses, tossing furniture around and breaking things like pots, and kind of throwing like a bit of fire around. Like it was kind of freaky. And then people affected by the malady, they would have a dream of the objects that they desired. And then they were showered with gifts. And then when they were given what they desired, when they're like, after all these, like, oh yes, it was the tobacco that I wanted, or it was that robe, or, then they would believe that that's a sign that their troubles are over and they will be cured. And at the end of the festival, this shower of gifts, they were returned except for that desired object. So again, that kind of restores the balance to the community by not having, that dozen people who got all these things and they gave them back. It's just kind of what they did. Now, the ritual that really got the Jesuits to lose it was the one called the Andakwander. So this ritual was to cure more of an individual sick person who other methods hadn't worked, I guess. And it involved having the unmarried people go to the sick person's house and have sex with one another in front of him all night.
I mean, that's going to cheer a lot of people up. Like,
yeah,
not just the sick person, but everybody else,
Yep. And the shamans would sing and perform the ceremony. And the Jesuits didn't like that one very much. That was too much for them.
Because they weren't getting invited, or
they were invited, but they weren't happy to be there. They were not cool. They were not cool guests to benefit the community. So those rituals are a little different than what was happening in the Western world. But societal structure itself was quite familiar to a Western observer. They had gender roles, like very clear gender roles, which is something that the French would have seen and been like, oh yeah. So women looked after the home and young children with the support of the other women in her family. Women would live with their sisters and their family. So men would come into a woman's family home. And this connection is reflected on how cousins referred to one another within that longhouse. They called each other brother and sister, and they called their aunts and mother and grandmother. They would call their fathers brothers, children, cousins.
Okay. So on the matrilineal side, your siblings, and on the patrilineal side, your cousins.
That's right. So women were, they were responsible for all of the farming and meal preparation and also clothing. Men and young boys, they did not help with that. They were, well, I'm sure they cared for their children, but not making clothing, and they were not doing farming. So what were they doing? They built the longhouses, they built the canoes, the weapons, obviously warrior training, hunting, trade, but something that was very physically taxing and took a lot of time was the clearing of fields, which they had to basically continuously be in preparation for, because after 10 to 15 years, the fields would be exhausted because they did not do any crop rotation or fertilizer to replace the nutrients. So there would just be a declining of yield over time. And then they were like, well, we just moved to a new field. And that's when they would do a big village changeover. So when they were clearing the fields, they're not miles and miles away. They're like, wherever there's forest, you clear it. So, which is like it's all forest. Oh yeah, women made the pottery as well. And an interesting way that archaeologists can get an understanding of intermarriage patterns between nations is to look at the pottery.
So like decorative patterns or like construction technique?
More patterns, decorative patterns. They probably would have had very similar ways to kiln fire the pottery. But yeah, the decorations, you would see, like, because Haudenosaunee women would be kidnapped, adopted into the family, but also Anishinaabe women would be more of an intermarrying situation to have the women in the village. And then they would you're sitting making pottery, you would just make what your mother taught you. And then you would use, you're like, oh, I like that. And then you kind of integrate and, the kind of blending, because you're all sitting together, just doing all this stuff, talking and being together all the time within the longhouse or just outside the longhouse. I don't know where they made the pottery. So while the girls worked with their mothers and aunts with domestic and farming work, the young boys basically participated in play-based learning to prepare for their future lives as warriors and hunters. So they would play ball games, they'd spearfish, shoot arrows, and just generally gadded about. I'm sure they were following their uncles and fathers around to learn from them, kind of hang around as the men kind of grouped together and talked and had councils. And
was there a specific age at which that? So I think, and I'm going to be really rusty on this, I think like with Aztecs, it was sometime around age 7, 8. Like prior to that, mothers watched both genders of kids, and then there was a point at which boys would move to hanging out with the male side of things. Was there sort of an age at which that split happened, or
no, really, just more because they would just, as long as they could be around, they would probably they probably stick close to their mothers when they're really little, but then they just start to gradually be with their older boys, older brothers and older cousins, and then they would go fishing and whatnot and kind of play around. But even when they're little, they wouldn't help their mothers.
Okay.
Like you wouldn't have like a 5-year-old boy helping make
pottery.
Or honestly, I bet you that happened. I can't see it not happening. Can you not see?
I can't imagine anyone convincing a 2-year-old not to play with clay. I don't care which gender they are.
No. So they would have, when they were following around the men, they would have seen the importance of calm rhetoric amongst other men. Like if they're having arguments because someone wants to go to war or someone wants to do something different, or they're whatever it is they're arguing about, steady, calm, no emotion. To be overly emotional was seen as womanly, so you would just be stoic. I guess the rhetorical devices wouldn't be quite the same as us, because the rise and fall of the language, like when someone's making a speech, you wouldn't have that. It would be just steady, and like you don't interrupt each other, things like that. So to be an ideal man in the Wendat world, he would be a good warrior, good hunter, clever in trade, and to have a reputation for giving wise counsel. Now, interrelations between men and women of the romantic kind started in puberty, naturally, and boys and girls were very sexually liberated. The teenage years of a Wendat youth was just theirs. Whatever they wanted. They would just try each other out all the time. And if a young woman did get pregnant, and there was multiple potential fathers, all of the young men would claim parentage, and the young woman would choose who she wanted.
That works.
Yep. And once married, men and women were monogamous, and divorce was an option. So before, if they got married and they didn't have children, a chance of divorce was much higher.
Okay.
But once they had children, it was less likely, but still would happen. So if they're having marital problems, the family would try and help them solve it. But if they couldn't, let them go, let them separate.
Well, I mean, it's the same sort of thing of like, if you all have to try and find a way to get along,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you try and resolve the conflict, and if it's not going to, then having a couple continuing to live in acrimony is going to be much more disruptive.
Yeah, because it's a communal house. You're living there with your sister, your mother, your grandmother, your grandfather, their husbands.
Who are all rolling their eyes because you guys have had this argument 1,000 times already, people. Seriously.
Yeah. Like the houses were like 20 feet wide by like 40 to 60. I could be quite a little wrong on that. Like there were maybe not feet, but like they're not huge. And you had your own space for your family, but it's open. Like you're with each other a lot.
Yeah.
So that's why divorce would be an option. And it makes it easier having a matrilineal society. If you have children and you need to divorce, well, the man just leaves.
Yeah.
So you can carry on. Your family will be looked after, and he will go back to his family, I assume, get another wife, whatever. Adultery, of course, did happen. So that's kind of how they kept that peace amongst the village. But I'm sure there would be so much gossip. Right?
You are not going to believe what they were doing last week in the other longhouse over there. Did you hear them?
They were fighting so much. Can someone please talk to them and get them sorted out? Yeah, because again, it's like
it's a small. You got a small village.
Yeah.
Of course, there's gossip.
And there's only so they had different within the nation. They would have different clans, like Turtle and whatever. So you didn't intermarry. You had to marry outside your clan.
Yeah.
So you would all know who's who. I'm sure the teenagers knew that. Oh, this guy is from the Bear clan, so I'm not going to go with him because that's taboo. All right. So status within the community for men, you had to be a wise leader and a renowned warrior. And it was the older men that held this status because it had to be earned over time. So naturally, this chafed against the young men's ambitions. So older men did not want to disrupt peace whenever possible, but younger men wanted to earn their battle stripes, so to speak. So they would pick fights, which would lead to war or like a blood feud. So if a warrior was killed, their family would seek revenge against his killer. Then their family would seek revenge if they succeeded in killing him, and so on. So to stop this endless bloodshed, a family could give gifts to the family to keep peace and stop the vengeance cycle. This would be done if tempers within the village. So if there was a fight within the village and someone was hurt or killed, so they would probably try and give gifts to keep the peace within the village rather than kill. Yeah, like it was a murder rather than a fight with an enemy. But if it's a fight against an enemy, they would know who did it, because again, even with their enemies, they still know each other. So that's what they would. So it's now on to warfare. So if there was a call for warfare, since I brought that up, against the Wendat enemies, it was the war chiefs that would organize that, and there were hereditary chiefs that were more like governmental leaders. So they kind of maintain when big ceremonies needed to happen. They would the Feast of the Dead, like things like that. And they would have daily councils, but also the war chiefs would be part of the group too. They would always be, these are older men. They'd be hanging out all the time together. That's what they would do. So we have to keep in mind, these are villages of about 1,000 people, right? So just think about their percentage. Like half of them are women and girls. Yeah. And then certain percentage are children, and certain percentage are young warriors and young teenage boys. Then there's only so many, 100, 200 older men. So, and if some of them are the chiefs, and then, they would always be chatting. So when it was time to go to war, the warriors would have a big send-off feast, and they would travel with a sort of pack ration of easy-to-eat cornmeal that did not need to be cooked. They would take a lot with them, so they didn't have to stop and hunt. Sometimes they'd sneak into an enemy village and kill whoever they could to try and capture enemy warriors, and other times they would have like more pitched battles. They would set up outside a palisaded village, and then their warriors would come out, and they would wear armor, and the armor was like wooden slat armor. Now, of course, battles and warfare are just the same everywhere. You physically attack your enemy, incapacitate him, or kill him before he did it to you. But these battles would not result in the eye-wateringly high casualty numbers of Western warfare, even in that time period. So, for example, 1400 like to 1500, like we're talking Wars of the Roses. So, like Henry IV and Richard III and those people.
Yeah, giant battles with hundreds dead, and when you're done, you just go back through the battlefield, find everybody who's wounded, and finish them off.
Yeah. Yeah. They would. It would be a little bit like earlier period, like 1300, 1200, like the 100 Years' War, like Agincourt, where they would take hostages of the nobility.
Okay.
But
and then ransom them back, or
no,
like keep them?
They would keep. They didn't go back. But you're not looking. But the battle itself would be so. Even if it was a big pitched battle, if it was a massive war party of like 1,000 warriors came to a Haudenosaunee village, and their warriors knew they're coming, and they had so you're looking at 2,000 men fighting. Mm-hmm. You're not going to end up with 1,000 casualties. They would stop after like 100, and then whoever won would take the warriors that they could capture back to their villages. And the way they did that was pretty nasty. So yeah, they weren't annihilating each other. They wanted to take them captive. They took the women and children captive, but more often than not, they didn't want to take the women and children. They would kill them on the spot and take their scalps. Super gnarly. So the prize would be a warrior, a captured warrior. So what they would do is they needed to march them home. So they would tie them up, but they would cut their shoulders and necks to like because they'd have their hands tied behind their backs. So you can't, it's really difficult to wiggle your way out of that if you've had all your tendons and muscles cut in your shoulders. The first thing they would do is they would cut or bite off their fingers.
Okay.
So, yeah, I was like, oh man. And tear out their fingernails.
Okay.
So very hands-on, very visceral, very like, and this was, so then they'd get them back. And sometimes they would take them back, and then they would be adopted into families while their fate was decided by the chiefs.
Okay.
So it would be a family of someone who's had their loved one killed by this group. And sometimes they got adopted back into the family and lived.
Okay. Sort of a replacement for who died.
Yeah. But usually wasn't done without torture.
Okay.
So, but if they did decide that, nope, this guy's it, he's done, they would have a day or multiple days of pretty hideous torture. So let's go into that. So buckle up. So it was basically a prisoner sacrifice. That's what it was. Okay. So it was very sacred, and it was very personal, and everybody was involved with the torture. So this time period is Reformation and Counter-Reformation, right? So it's getting pretty gnarly over in Europe too.
In Europe, yeah.
But it wasn't individual, like the whole village wasn't coming out to do the torture. It would have been the priestly
Well, it would have been, in this case, in North America, it was the representative, or it was the whole village coming out?
The whole village. So the whole, like, it would be in a longhouse. So not everybody in the village. So all of the children, like, people lived there, right? So it would be the torture happened in the home.
Okay. I mean, public executions were still popular viewing. Mm-hmm. You pack a picnic lunch and take the kids and go watch some people be executed.
Yeah.
In Europe at that time too.
the burning of the stake, and
Yeah.
but the pre-show was indoors usually for the Europeans, like the rack and things like that. But yeah, so anyways, because it was a reclamation of the soul, like of their people, this vengeance. So their people have been taken.
Okay.
So this person is atoning for that, and they would be made to sing, and they would have like a mournful song that they would probably prepare, like of their basically like their life story of who they were.
Okay.
They would try to sing through the whole torture as a mark of their fortitude. So it would begin in the evening, and it would take maybe several days, but they would always keep the person alive until morning so that they would die outside so the sun could be a witness
Okay.
to this, because it was a sun sacrifice, which is really interesting because they are people who grow corn. They are people who grow beans and squash, like the Mayan people.
I was gonna say there's a definite tie there too, because the Mayans and the Aztecs, it was the goal was to capture a future sacrifice, which is one of the reasons. I mean, jumping ahead on your stories, but it's in a different part of the world, so I think it's okay. That the Spanish in battle were there to kill,
Yeah,
and the Aztecs were trying to like capture people, and that's going to be an uneven footing when you go to battle.
yeah.
So yeah, is this then? This is groups that have gradually moved further and further north and moved into sort of this territory.
No, it's more of a religious influence rather than, these aren't former Mayan. They aren't.
It's not groups moving further up. It's the ideas moving rather than the people.
That's right. So in previous episode, when I was talking about the Hopewell people, like spheres of influence, the treatment of the dead and things like that, they just adopt it, and especially because of the agricultural adoption. So they were taught probably by the same, like it just kind of, oh, this is what we do, and this is how you plant these things, and this is, oh, that's great. Oh, I'm going to take that home, and up the river they go, and then that just kind of evolves in their own way. Like obviously the Aztec and the Mayan, they had very different gods, and they had much more well-established kind of,
quite elaborate. Yeah.
very elaborate. Like they had a very elaborate priestly class, or very powerful. I mean, not elaborate.
Would cannibalism have been part of this? So like,
Sure did. Yep. All right, let's go in. Let's just go into what happened. This guy's worst day. So yeah, it's an act of blood revenge.
Okay.
And then the sacrifice to the sun god and renewal and all this sort of things. So they would be stripped of whatever clothes they still had, and then they would make their way from one end of the longhouse to the other, running this gauntlet of hell. They would poke them with flames. They would cut pieces out, and they would stick flame sticks into the wounds. The flaming sticks would go in other places. So they would start the torture on the limbs because they want them to survive till morning. So you're not going stabs in the torso and things like that. So it's limbs and genitals that are going to get the brunt of this at first. And then they would break. So they break the hands, they break the feet. A lot of fire, and hot ashes and rubbing. And there would be a lot of, the people there would be mocking them. It would be very disturbing to watch.
Yeah.
So because of how personal it was, so the Jesuits, like, they witnessed a ton of torture, and they would have, like, it was normal for them to see, oh yes, you have to burn this person at the stake. Of course you did.
Yeah.
You had to break them. You had to get the truth out of them, or whatever it was. And same with the Protestants, like they did the same, the back and forth.
Yeah.
But the intimacy of this longhouse torture situation was very shocking to them. If their strength was failing, they would kind of let them rest a bit, and they give them some water and to perk them up. And eventually they would have to carry him and stop torturing so he wouldn't die before sunrise. And when he would revive, he would often sing again. So just this fortitude, this strength of this warrior. all through the night. And then the morning that the prisoner was to die, so like I said, because sometimes they would do multiple nights, they would go through this. They would build a scaffold 6 or 7 feet high, and they would make the prisoner climb it, or they would place him on it, depending on how
far along they were. Yeah.
Yeah. But he would try. Like, if he was able, he would do it. Like, the strength that they would show through this torture is amazing. And so they would burn his body and attack his vital organs, be made to eat pieces of his own flesh, and honestly, I don't even want to say it. It's gross. So then he would be burned and stuck, and then they'd let him bleed out, and he would finally die. But then they would cut out his heart, and they would eat it. So that's very much like what we'd see, like in the Aztec, and the heart kind of.
I was going to say that there's the heart removal, but like I think in the Aztec, it's that the entire body is consumed. And
okay,
the interpretation I have heard, and obviously this is hearsay and not based on me having a whole lot of research background, was it's related to like there weren't as many sources of protein, and so there's some aspects.
That's how it started?
Yeah, potentially.
Before.
But again, take that with a massive grain of salt. That is me trying to vaguely remember things I've heard. So,
fair enough.
It's also possible it's a hitchhiker story or urban legend kind of thing.
So. They cut off the hands and feet and cut out the heart, and they eviscerated the corpse. And the children took the intestines to hang them off of sticks and go run around and play with them. That would have been horrifying to see. But that was life. That was the way it was. So yeah, and if the prisoner had been they would have only eaten the heart if he had been extremely brave in his time. So if he had died not bravely, they would have just let it go.
Yeah.
Well, because it wouldn't be very empowering to consume that.
Yeah.
Not everybody loved this part, the eating of the human flesh.
No.
Some were horrified, and some dug it, like they were into it. So some were really, but they did it anyways because of the ritual, some importance of it. So yeah, on this after sunset on the day the prisoner was killed, everyone made a huge racket to chase away the victim's spirit, to get rid of.
Okay.
So speaking of dead spirits and things like that, the feast, let's talk about how they treated the dead. So people who died violently, they would not be included in the Feast of the Dead. They would have been buried immediately. And another thing, people who drowned or froze to death also were not included in the Feast of the Dead. So they would have had their flesh cut off, and the flesh and entrails would have been burned, and then the skeleton would have been buried.
Okay.
And they would do it right away. And it was so that they wouldn't anger the sky or lake spirits. They did that to prevent more similar misfortune happening to the people. Okay. So I thought that was an interesting differentiation. Oh, and very, very young children were not part of the Feast of the Dead. So babies and little wee ones, they were buried on pathways, alongside pathways.
Okay.
So that when women are passing by, that baby's soul could enter that woman's womb, and that person could be reborn.
Okay.
Because they had two souls, basically, one that was reborn and one that died and went to the village of the dead or wherever. So the Feast of the Dead, what was that? Because I've talked about that quite a bit, or mentioned it quite a bit. So this is really important. So they would have their cemeteries of, the regular deaths. And people took care of that because they believed that their souls were still there. But when you were leaving the village, no one was going to be able to take care of them anymore. So they needed to be gathered up and have this big feast that would take 10 days. This whole process was 10 days. So in the first 3 days, it was the women that took care of things. So they would be dug up, and if they were already decomposed, the skeletons would be gathered into a beaver skin bag, and then they're ready to go into the next stage. But if they were not, if they were partially decomposed, they would be defleshed, and that would be burned. So it would be pretty. Bruce Trigger notes that the women did this. What was the term he used? Basically, with incredible fortitude. They were not grossed out. They were tough. they could handle it because it would have, like, there was worms and like it was a lot. So they would deflesh them. And then again, once that was done, bones are cleaned, into the bag they go.
Yeah.
If someone is recently dead, they would not deflesh the body. So those would go on like a scaffold.
Okay.
And then they would have this big ceremony. There'd be feasting and gifts and goods put into this kind of pit. They called it a kettle. I don't know why they called it a kettle. Then basically a hut would be put over it. So when I was talking about the Hopewell people, this would be very similar to the Hopewell mounds.
Okay.
That they'd put this hut over, and then the people would be there, and I forgot to mention the beaver skin bags. So they would open the bags, and then they would pour the bones, and they would always make sure that everyone was intermingled, the bones, which was so they would always be together and intermingled. It was a very important part of that.
Okay. Must drive archaeologists bonkers.
Yeah, it's quite the challenge. Yeah, so then they would build this hut over it, and build it, whatever, kind of safely protected, and then eventually that would rot and collapse, and then it would be
all buried over and sealed up.
Because they would move on, right? So they would move on to another village, then every 10 or 15 years. And this was a huge cultural event for the surrounding villages. They would have other people from villages come. They would have allies come. Sometimes they would invite their allies to join the intermingling.
Yes.
But sometimes they were just guests. So I guess it depends on how important they were.
Yeah. I guess like you'd be then sharing space in the afterlife, so it would build a connection.
Yeah.
So you'd have to value them enough to be like, yeah, we want you guys being our allies for eternity.
Yeah, because they would travel. Because once they were buried in this Feast of the Dead, their souls could depart to the village of the dead. So they would go together.
Oh, okay.
So you want your good travel companions. If you're going to make that trip, you got to have people you like. And that's why babies and very young children couldn't, because they're terrible travelers.
Yes.
So they had another go. So yeah, those are the Feast of the Dead, and I think that's pretty much it. I think I got it all covered. Just looking at my notes here, there's so much that I missed. I did not cover all of the different clan system. But I'm leaving room for more for another day. So is there any like questions or things that you were wondering about that I didn't quite cover that you were curious about?
No, like it covered quite a lot of stuff. And it's sort of interesting to see, sort of in terms of in time, ways in which Europeans and North America, like they wouldn't have been intermingling yet. Mm-hmm. And yet there were some ways in which they were similar. Mm-hmm. So like ossuaries exist in Europe at this time.
Catacombs.
Yeah, like that sort of, like houses where all of the dead are buried together kind of thing would still exist. And so just sort of that ways in which people end up in similar places through different paths.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and the agricultural norms of women working together and the men doing their thing. And whereas in other, like Anishinaabe, there would be maybe a little bit more mixed.
Everyone's going hunting together.
Yeah, like men would still hunt more, but I thought that was kind of that makes sense.
The farming revolution and the impact on gender norms.
Exactly.
As it impacts everywhere. Yeah.
That's right. And that's why when the French came, they're like, oh yeah. Okay, I see what you're doing here. They knew this story. Whereas it was a little bit more, well, what are you guys up to over like the Ojibwe or something like that? Okay, it's a little different. I hadn't seen that before. So yeah, I think so. The next episode, I'm going to be talking about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So they were in parallel, and they were enemies, big time, which is so interesting because they have a lot of the same, like their Sky Woman story is the same, more or less. I'm like, where did you guys, like, what happened? Like, it's so interesting.
Well, there's a reason why those twin stories, right? Yeah. It's always the really close that to be able to drive each other nuts.
Yeah. So when I was doing the research, I don't have a good answer about why they were such enemies, because the Haudenosaunee were a lot of people's enemies, but they were also had a very tight confederacy. So it's a very interesting thing, but we'll get into that. And I think I have Heather coming next week. So thank you guys for listening. And I hope you listen to the next one and subscribe, all that good stuff, whatever people do. For me, I'm a Spotify listener, so I hit that follow button. If you're Apple, I don't know what you do for Apple. I can't remember. It's been a long time since I used that. I don't know. Anyways, thanks so much, Jessica. I really, really appreciated having you over. And I really hope you can come back and we'll talk about something else cool in history.
Yeah, no, this was a lot of fun. Thanks.